That's all right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to stand and take a call on the second reading of the infrastructure bill. And I think that contribution from the chair of the Transport Select Committee, David Bennett, would have been a lot more sincere if he hadn't been grinning the whole way through it. He might want to review the tapes and reflect on how serious he seems when he grins the whole way through it. And when he criticised my learned colleague Shane Jones for his contribution, claiming that Shane Jones was just there to fill up time, I think there was a little bit of a case of the pot and the kettle and the colour black that David Bennett might want to consider for his next foray into this House. Mr. Speaker, I want to focus on part 4 of this piece of legislation, which is the repeal of the Affordable Housing Territorial Authorities Act, which Labor introduced in our last term of government. And the first thing I would like to say about that is, and I'd like the next national speaker to comment on this, why was that particular move included in the infrastructure bill? Why? Because it's not the natural place that people would look to see that if they were interested in that particular piece of legislation, when they saw that the infrastructure bill was before Parliament, I doubt that it would have occurred to them that the affordable housing legislation was being repealed as part of the Infrastructure Act. And in fact, we had people, when we were going through the process of the Select Committee submissions, where Labor and Green members were raising concerns about some of the changes in that respect, who contacted us and said we had no idea that this was happening because we didn't know to look to the Infrastructure Act for the repeal of legislation on affordable housing. And I think that that's a sincere question that the government needs to answer, because it appears to me that they were hiding that change in this infrastructure legislation because it actually has no place in that legislation. And not only that, but that particular part of the bill should have gone to either the Local Government and Environment Select Committee that heard and dealt with the original bill, or to Social Services Select Committee, which deals with housing. The Transport and Industrial Relations Select Committee was not the proper forum for... I know I was on the committee, David, I was there. But a number of submitters looked to the Local Government and Environment and the Social Services Select Committees for issues pertaining to housing and to affordable housing. And even though the Select Committee made every effort, as limited as we were in that respect, to contact the submitters who submitted on the original bill and to contact people we thought who might be interested, that doesn't change the fact that there were people who contacted us after the fact who'd missed out because they didn't expect that that particular piece of legislation would be dealt with under an infrastructure bill. The second thing I want to deal with is the issue of restrictive covenants, because the Minister said that they had kept the clause on restrictive covenants in this piece of legislation. Well, that's strictly not correct. They've kept a clause on restrictive covenants in this piece of legislation, but they've actually watered it down. The government's watered it down quite significantly from the existing enacted clause on restrictive covenants. Because what was in the original piece of legislation that Labor passed in our last year in government was this wording: a covenant over land is void if one of its purposes is to stop the provision of affordable housing or social housing on the land. That was the gist of what the existing Act says. Now, what the government has changed that to is that it has to be the principal purpose. And when this bill originally went to the Local Government and Environment Select Committee, and I was the chair of that Select Committee when we dealt with it, we heard examples of restrictive covenants that had been used where the principal purpose was amenity value, or they wanted all the houses to look the same. But we were told that the actual purpose of that covenant was to stop, for example, disability access housing going in, or it could be used to stop state housing, or it could be used to stop affordable housing. But it's done under the guise of being about all the houses looking the same, amenity value. So unless you say that it's not okay for any purpose of a restrictive covenant to restrict affordable or social housing, then you open up a huge loophole which actually makes this clause meaningless. Because all you have to do is hide your primary purpose for restricting affordable and social housing, claim it's for another reason, and you can get away with it. And that's what the original Select Committee tried to stop by saying that if any of the purposes were to stop affordable or social housing, then that wasn't okay. Now, the other thing the government's done is they've removed the ban on restrictive covenants against affordable housing. So for some reason the government thinks it's okay for a restricted covenant to be used to ban affordable housing in a development. And when we questioned Housing New Zealand about it, they just said, oh, well, it's just that we don't think it's likely to happen. Well, the fact is we had people come to the original Select Committee, and we may have had people come to this Select Committee if they'd known that the repeal of this Act was in the infrastructure bill, who could have told us quite plainly that these restrictive covenants have been used to stop social housing or affordable housing. And sure, it doesn't happen in a lot of cases, but it shouldn't happen at all. And now there has been a green light given to any developer who wants to use restrictive covenants to stop affordable housing. So again, I would like the next National Party Speaker to explain why it is that it's okay to have restrictive covenants against affordable housing. Well, they've all gone very quiet now, Mr. Speaker. They were very vocal not that long ago, but it is a genuine question because we're opening up an enormous loophole. Mr. Carter was on the Select Committee who heard the original piece of legislation. I'm sure he remembers the discussions that we had, and I look forward very much to his contribution in this debate. So we come to the main part of this Part 4 of the legislation, and while Labor will be supporting the infrastructure bill, we will not be supporting Part 4. Is the repeal of the Affordable Housing Territorial Authorities Enabling Act. Now, the Minister in his original speech, first speech on the second reading of this legislation said that the reason we had to get rid of it was because it wasn't working and because it was actually increasing the cost of housing. Well, this isn't a compulsory measure. This was a tool that local authorities or territorial authorities could use if they wanted to, if they saw some value in it. It was a piece of legislation which clarified that legally they were able to do this. They were able to require developers to pay a levy contribution which could go towards affordable or social housing. So it made it quite clear that they couldn't be taken to court because someone says that it's outside the law for them to do that. But the fact is that if councils didn't want to use it and thought that it might increase costs, even though at Select Committee we were given no evidence of that whatsoever, then they don't need to use it. So claims that we have to get rid of this because it's increasing the cost of housing are simply not true and cannot be verified. And what the Labor Party believes is that, and we accept there may be ways that piece of law could be written better. There may be changes that we could make to it, which would make it more user-friendly or which would allay some of the concerns that submitters had on that original piece of legislation. So our point was send it back to a Select Committee. Have another look at it. Change it if need be. But given that affordable housing is such an important issue in New Zealand, that many, many more young people and older people are being locked out of the opportunity of ever owning their own home, why would you just simply get rid of a tool which potentially could be used? And as with everything in affordable housing, there's no one silver bullet. You have a range of different tools that you can use, and depending on the economic environment, depending on the housing environment, at any one time, certain tools are going to be more useful than others. And then the environment changes and another tool becomes more useful and another one stops being used as much. But the fact is you have to have a range of tools available to deal with affordable housing. And this was an important one. This is one which would say to it, and this is a tool, by the way, which is used extensively throughout the rest of the world. Extensively. No, the National Party does not support that. It is certainly not uncommon overseas for state governments or local authorities to require developers to, for example, provide housing for workers if they're doing a big commercial development, to require transport, public transport for workers, or in housing developments to have a portion of that set aside for social or affordable housing. These are things which happen extensively throughout the United States of America, and I see Mr. Peachy's in the House. He's twitching. He thinks this is part of the socialist agenda. The Cold War goes on for Mr. Peachy. The wall never came down in Alan Peachy's world, and he's sitting over there twitching, wondering what Red's under the bed scheme I've got going here. And I can assure Mr. Peachy, it's not. It's about providing a range of tools which allow people to get into affordable housing, and this was a very important tool that we're losing here. When